Civil liberties are something that are recognized by our U.S. Constitution and our U.S. laws. They're individual rights, rights that we all understand, respect, and expect our government to hold true, including the right to a fair trial, the right not to be tortured, the right to have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. They're so important to protect, and particularly in this context, because they're actually in jeopardy at the moment. I think since September 11th, the U.S. government has begun building an incredible domestic security infrastructure that in fact infringes not only on immigrant communities' rights or particular groups' rights, but on all of our rights. And I think rights and civil liberties are one of those things that we don't fully appreciate until they're lost.
9/11 was a sea change in the way people began to understand how our government works and what the Constitution is all about. It used to be that if you asked kids who is the most powerful person in the American government, they would say in the civics lessons, well, the president isn't more powerful than Congress, and Congress isn't more powerful than the judiciary, and none of them are more powerful than us. Since 9/11, when the national security situation began to arise, people began to become concerned about our safety. The president, George Bush at the time, seized unprecedented power. And he literally tried to change the constitutional landscape where the president became the most powerful figure in our democratic process.
After September 11th and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, there was tremendous pressure on federal agencies to better share information across agencies. A lot of people blamed September 11th on the failure of the CIA and the FBI to share information about potential terrorist threats. So in reaction, the federal government has really overstepped its reach. And now they've created an incredible domestic infrastructure, all targeting potential domestic threats to national security.
This country did something that, when they do it, democracies die. We ceded a tremendous amount of power that we have as people to the President of the United States. We began to say, we want you to keep us safe, and it doesn't really matter to us that you're going to be violating our rights here and violating our rights there. And the President of the United States took that power and ushered in an era in which it was virtually impossible for the president to be checked whether he did things illegally, unlawfully, or even unwise.
You know, I'd be the last person to tell you that there aren't bad people out there. There are certainly bad people out there, and people who would do harm. And, you know, it's something that it's the government's obligation to stop that harm where they can, or at least prosecute it afterwards to create a deterrent effect for others. After 9/11, what we've seen is a movement away from investigations that are based upon reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing and surveillance that required either a warrant or at least that reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing into basically suspicionless collection. You know, the FBI's guidelines have changed a number of times, most recently in 2008, to where now they can do an investigation with no factual basis to believe anybody has done anything wrong, not just the person they're investigating, but anybody. I mean, it's an incredibly broad grant of power that the Attorney General gave to the FBI. In order for the FBI to sort of work with that, within that kind of framework, they have to take shortcuts. And what we've seen them doing is using race and political ideology and religion as shortcuts and basically engage in racial, religious, and ideological profiling.
You know, some of my friends, they laughed. They said, oh, you know, it's an honor to be put on like a government watch list. Believe me, it's not. It's really frightening, and it just causes, you know, mistrust. And when you do that to a community leader, it really kind of terrorizes all the people in the community, because you know, you're trying to encourage them to be politically active, to stand up for their rights, to, you know, stand up against discrimination. And then you yourself are targeted, and now you're involved in this lawsuit. So It's really an effective way to frighten the community.
Targeting immigrants is not a new story. It's a story that we've heard of from a very long time, starting in 1798 with the Alien Sedition Act, where it made it very easy to expel people from the United States for being an undesirable person in the United States, and that could include many different things. Maybe you're a drunkard, maybe you don't agree with the politics of the United States.
For a lot of people who've come to this country as immigrants, their experience with their governments has not always been a positive one. And for many of them, the government was authoritarian or dictatorial, and there was no trust in government. Many of them, that's why they chose to come to the United States. But when, in the United States, the government plays that role of spying on them, of watching their religious practices, of observing them in their community, cafes, restaurants, libraries, whatever, it actually makes them, once again, fearful of all government activity.
With respect to privacy, though, I think it's a strange confluence of circumstances, and I don't think one necessarily feeds the other. I don't think that they are deporting Latino folks so that they can try out their spying tools, and I don't think that they're having spying tools for the purposes of deporting Latino folks. But I do think that there are some smart people in government that see how the two are connected, and that they can use a policy that they formerly thought was very positive, like let's get rid of all the undocumented people, and try out some of those tools to do it more efficiently.
I think non-citizens easily are the first targets for any kind of surveillance plan.
Their primary goals are to secure the border and to conduct interior immigration enforcement. And the way that this plays out under the Obama administration is that they have actually prioritized enforcement of immigration laws and the deportation of people who are here without documentation. The Secure Communities initiative was a real challenge for advocates who felt that this program did anything but secure our communities.
Secure Communities is an immigration program that is designed to target non-citizens who come into contact with the criminal justice systems.
The way the program works is that a person who is picked up by local police will be taken down to the police station, fingerprinted, and their fingerprints are submitted to the FBI. This is something we all are very familiar with from watching television shows and cop shows, but in fact, something new has been added to the FBI process. After the FBI checks the fingerprints to see if there's any criminal history, they then forward the fingerprints to ICE, to the Department of Homeland Security, where they check it against immigration databases. If a person is suspicious of being potentially eligible for deportation, then ICE may intervene and ask that the person be held for immigration purposes, not because of any actual criminal charges.
And I think that's what we're seeing as the trend, is that these immigration violations are treated like criminal offenses and national security threats. So even though they may be something as innocuous for failing to register on time, it goes into the system and it shows up in that criminal database as an outstanding warrant.
So it's not clear that Secure Communities is doing anything, in fact, to prevent or fight crime, but rather it's using a system where people come in contact with local police to then segue over to immigration enforcement.
My feeling is that the policy of the United States is to deport as many undocumented people as they possibly can. That is literally what the immigration laws are set up for. That is literally what the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is set up for. The systems to be able to determine how people can stay in this country lawfully or give them another chance pale in comparison in terms of resources and in terms of power to the systems that are actually removing people from the United States. So there's no doubt in my mind that particularly when it's focused on Latino folks or people of from a particular region of the world, that is done very, very deliberately.
A number of our member groups have been fighting against secure communities, and a number have been fighting against police surveillance of Muslims and Arabs and other communities. And the very consistent issues that come up are the complete lack of transparency or accountability.
I mean, the real objection I have with the Obama administration is that they've rolled out this program very quickly since the Bush administration launched it in 2008, and they've rolled it kind of recklessly. They rolled it without adequate safeguards, with very little transparency, using misleading statements to public officials saying what it was going to do and how it was going to work, giving the impression that localities could opt out, when in fact there was no, it was really a misleading broker deal that was on the table.
And so there's a very common theme that with no transparency, it's very difficult for community organizations or advocacy groups to know whether or not these programs are in fact causing more damage than actually contributing to national security. And it makes it hard to strategize about how best to counter them.
When the government spies on you, the government wins for a very short period of time, but the government loses in the end. If you think about al-Qaeda as a force that the government is fighting, it's one thing when the government says al-Qaeda is out there, so we're going to have policies with respect to al-Qaeda. But what happens when the government begins to treat people like there's a little bit of al-Qaeda in all of us?
You're not going to find terrorists by, scouring the Muslim community and finding out, who's reading what books and who's buying falafel and, who's going to the mosque. My number is 384-610 on the Terrorist Screening Center watch list. And it took me a really long, hard-fought legal battle to find that out. I have a very stressful job, so I don't get a lot of vacations, so I decided that I'd take a road trip and go to Canada. So I, packed my daughter into the car, and we drove to Canada, and we had a really nice time. And as we were coming back across the border at the Buffalo-Fort Erie Peace Bridge border crossing, I was basically stopped. The agent asked me to hand over my keys. They scanned my passport, and there was this beep or alarm sound, and I looked over at the agent's console, and it said in flashing red letters, it said armed and dangerous. I mean, I couldn't believe it.
I think what happened to Julia Shearson is wrong on so many levels. Personally, because I know Julia, it's heartbreaking to see, a very accomplished woman who's doing so much for her community and for her country being treated as if she's an enemy of that country is really shocking. The
agent asked me to hand over my keys and step out of the car, and then proceeded to handcuff my hands behind my back. And I remember looking into the car, the back seat of the car. My little daughter, she was only 4.5 at the time. She was wearing her little pink Oshkosh Bagosh, little overalls. And I remember her standing up like, what's happening to my mom?
And from the perspective of a former FBI agent, just the waste of resources that are going in, and knowing that unfortunately there isn't just one Julia. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. I mean, at one point, the Terrorist Screening Center watch list had over 1.1 million names on it. Nobody could really figure out, even the agents themselves, they couldn't figure out, why was I being stopped? Why did I have this, armed and dangerous code? It was very, very strange. And, the interview lasted for, 2.5 hours or so. And then they let me go. So then I started to walk to my car. And then I thought, well, this is really strange. They held me for 2.5 hours. What did they do to my car? And so I kind of walked back into the room, and I said, well, hey, did you guys search my car?
And the agent, this was a supervisory agent, and he said no. So, I believed him. He's an officer of the law, right? It wasn't until 3 months later when I got my information through Freedom of Information Act request that I saw that not only had they searched my car, but they basically tore the whole thing apart. They have the right to inspect you at the border. They have a lot of powers to inspect at the border. It's somewhat, it's understandable. They're looking for contraband or they're looking for criminals. But, this was excessive, I thought. It was clear that I wasn't, a danger to anybody, and I certainly wasn't armed and dangerous.
But for somebody who's actually wrongly put on a list like Julia, the work that it takes to try to clear your name and get your information pulled out of that system it's a gargantuan task.
And that's pretty scary to be labeled a terrorist by your government and have that stored permanently. And I thought, when I found this out, I looked at this and I thought, well, that's it. There goes my Ivy League degrees, all the effort that I put into my education. So if somebody Googles me and I'm looking for a job, oh, there she is, a suspected terrorist.
And it's something that simply shouldn't happen in the United States. Where the government has evidence to believe somebody's doing something wrong, they should conduct an investigation and move toward a prosecution. Where they don't, they shouldn't be putting innocent people's names on a list and impacting their rights to travel, potentially their future employment, all these other harms that can come from it, where there isn't enough evidence to actually charge them with a crime. It should be unacceptable in this country.
Well, what I would like is, first of all, I would like my name to be expunged from the data set. And I would like all the records related to that border stop, to be expunged. But more than that, I think that the government does not have a right to target the American people as they're coming into their own country, to do this kind of intensive data mining search about all their private records. I don't think the government should be allowed to do that. Personally identifiable information, detailed information about people can impact people's privacy. So the government, yes, it has a right to collect information to do its duties, but beyond those duties, it does not have a right to collect and store information.
What happens when they're spying on us, when they're collecting our information, they're tapping our phones, they're tapping our internet, that they're getting subpoenas from Twitter and Facebook and all of the social media that we love so much, and they're mining that information on a mega level for indicia, for indicators that people are interested in, thinking about, know anything about terrorist activity. That changes the paradigm. And so when the government thinks that its own people are the terrorists, that is the nature, essentially, of despotism down the road. I think that at the end of his life, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was quite convinced that everybody in Libya was a terrorist that was trying to overthrow the government. And look what happened to him. That's what ends up happening to societies when the powers that be begin to look at the people that make up that society as all having suspicion and not as people that together are trying to build a democratic, open society in which people can live with dignity.
It was actually uncovered a little bit by accident. The Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, and the Cardozo Law School collaborated in doing a FOIA request about secure communities. And what they uncovered was, in fact, this partnership between ICE and the FBI that actually mandated the FBI's role in connecting all of these different databases across government to share biometric information. So in addition to DHS and the immigration databases, they've also linked through the NGI program with the State Department, with all of its visa applications and passport information that they have in their database system, but also with the Department of Defense. Apparently, the Department of Defense has been collecting biometric data information in places where it's been operating in the last 10 years, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. That biometric information is also being fed into NGI. And so anytime any one of these federal agencies is looking for information about an individual, they're not just checking their own individual database, but in fact, they're looking at databases across the government.
We now know that secure communities is the first stage, the first step of next generation identification. Next generation identification is really a surveillance program, a data collection repository by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, where they're going to collect enormous amounts of data, our palm prints, tattoos, any body marks, and they're going to collect that information and they're going to store it, and they really started with non-citizens first through secure communities. It's in their materials. It was their first step. And now we know the problem is that when you start with non-citizens, it easily moves to citizens. And I think what citizens will find troubling is not only will it have information that seems criminal in nature, it's going to have things about your Social Security. It could have things about your work history. All the other things that the FBI can collect, which is civil in nature, there's no real understanding or belief that the FBI is not going to combine that kind of personal information with criminal information.
And the idea is that if all of the branches of government are sharing information, we will be in a better position to catch the terrorists and the people that want to hurt us. And while that makes some logical sense, what we give up by doing that is that we give the government complete and total control over our biometric information.
Where the Next Generation Index is going to be moving forward, according to materials that the FBI has published, is to try to make associations between people much in the way intelligence systems do. And that's really the problem, is it's moved away from simple criminal identification to housing a lot more innocent person information that can be used in ways that impact their privacy and civil liberties.
Now, in some ways, that's exactly what was intended in the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. They wanted federal government databases to talk to one another and to be able to share information. The scary part is that information that's going into the next generation system is also coming from people who have no training in intelligence or analysis. And so a local police officer may be providing information about somebody that they've stopped for a taillight infraction, and that's getting fed into something that's then linked in ways that we don't know about to other agencies' information.
And I don't think there are enough questions being asked to the FBI and to Congress about why we need this program right now and why is it so important to get all this information into one database. And I think secondarily the question is, do we even need it? And can we even use it?
Experts in the area of data collection all say that more data is not necessarily better data. And so the more information you have coming in, they actually have a phrase for it. It's called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. The more data you have coming in, the more it can obscure actually helpful information that analysts could use to, in fact, identify criminal behavior the way that analysts are supposed to do. But most of the time, because people are fearful, because people worry about the next terrorist attack, they're willing to give the government more leeway to, in fact, encroach on civil liberties. And I think in the end, the government is hoping to seize as much of that executive authority to be able to pry as much as possible into people's private lives in order to uphold their belief of what makes us safe. The problem is they're not calculating the costs of what that does to community trust in government.
The government has no business knowing you that closely unless you're doing something wrong, unless you're doing something illegal, you're harming people. Otherwise, the government really needs to, close its eyes and look the other way. It should not be, the government should not be the peeping Tom, in the name of national security. Everybody has things that they want to keep private. That's who we are as a people, that the inside of our minds, our personalities, our how should I say, our, the things that we enjoy, our freedoms, those things are intensely personal and intensely private.
For me, it's a question of value. A free society doesn't mean can't mean a monitored society. It presumes guilt, you know, and I think when we have a value in this country that you're innocent before you're guilty, that kind of monitoring is looking for guilt. And I just don't feel comfortable living in a country that is only looking for guilt and wrong behavior.
But here's the problem. The problem is if we consent to give all of this information, that at some level you're trusting the government to do something that even our Constitution doesn't trust the government to do, which is to use this information only for good and not for evil. And we know that the Constitution doesn't trust the government to do this, and in fact history shows that governments, when they amass power, they tend not to do this, because the Constitution of the United States puts checks on the power of the government precisely because they realize that the government cannot check itself, that the government never gives back power. The President of the United States, in the history of presidents, no president has ever given back power that he has gotten from a previous president.
People should be concerned about these issues, even if they're not targeted right now by these policies and programs, because it affects all of us. When people in our community are afraid to come forward and report crimes to law enforcement, it makes all of us less safe. I may be the victim of a crime because someone else didn't report what the person who perpetrates the crime looks like to the police. And so we need the community to work together with law enforcement in order to actually ensure community safety. And when law enforcement is playing a different role than protecting the community, it makes all of us less safe.
I think the impact of all this secret activity where Americans don't have any transparency into what the government's doing, where there are these negative consequences on completely innocent people, has really changed the nature of our relationship with our government. And, you know, to have a democratic society where the people can't know what the government is doing, I think it challenges the very notion of democracy. And I think that we have to be a lot more careful about what authorities our government is using and what we're doing to make sure that those authorities aren't being abused. Part of the technological revolution I've been talking about is the opportunity for people to focus on a cause and to get a lot of people aware of it. So I do think that there's an opportunity for people's voices to be heard, and it can make a difference. I mean, we've seen it happen over and over again, so I am hopeful.